We are talking about the next generation, and if you need a Bible, slip up your hand and turn to Acts 28. When you get that Bible, if you have one, you can go ahead and turn there now. And like I said, we're talking about partnering with the next generation. And we talk about that word partnership within the student ministry and even the kids ministry in about 4 ways. We partner with God because he not only partnered with us, but he also called us to be a part of the story of advancing God's kingdom, the story of his love for us through Jesus Christ. But not only do we partner with him, we partner with parents, you here in the room, and even maybe friends that you have that have students. We partner with you because you are the primary disciple makers of your students' lives. We partner with the schools. We recognize that whenever the school has a need or a way that we can serve, we want to step up to the plate and serve in that way. And just, I know we talked about this a second ago. We talked about Kids Life and the Good News Clubs. I want to talk a little bit too about our Thrive Clubs. We have shared in this Dream for 17 that we shared kind of in the beginning of the year, about the next generation just a little bit, and some of you here, even in the room, have kind of stepped up to the plate. This past week, we went to Sweetwater Middle School to go to a parent meeting, and in that parent meeting, we talked about what Thrive could be. And as we begin to talk about what Thrive could be, all of these parents said, is this like Good News Club? Because if it is, we want this in this middle school. If this is like the Good News Clubs that my kids have experienced, we want this. So I just want to give a round of applause to the kids team for leading these Good News Clubs, getting these things started, moving them into areas even outside of our own sphere of influence. And I'm a youth pastor, so I'm goofy, and I want to do something really goofy and fun, and hopefully you can get a little bit out of your comfort zone. A lot of the kids team is downstairs. They're actually serving the next generation right now. And so they probably couldn't hear that round of applause, but they can hear you when you stomp your feet. I know we have Lug Live here on Wednesday nights, and when we jump up and down, they know we're above them. And so what I want to do is I want us to stomp our feet on the count of 3, and then after the service, hopefully some of them will come up to you once you grab your student or grab your child, and you say, what was that? Was that an earthquake? Was that thunder? What's happening? No, we just wanted to say thank you, and we did it with our feet. So that's what we're gonna do. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, that was great. Okay, y'all having too much fun. You can stop, that was great. Maybe we should just continue to do that throughout the service. But I have been blessed to get to partner with Denise and the kids team, and I recognize that we couldn't do this on our own. I couldn't reach little kids. I couldn't reach the elementary schools, the Good News Clubs, the Thrive Clubs, all that stuff. I recognize that when we partner together to partner with the school, we get to see the kingdom of God being advanced, not only in the kids' lives, but in the parents' lives. And lastly, we partner not only with the schools and partner with the parents and with God, but we partner with our students. And I'll share a little bit about that as we open God's word together about how to partner with our students and what it begins to look like. I first learned about the word partnership in 2010. I've heard the idea, I get discipleship, I get disciple making, I get that God's called us to advance the kingdom on the earth, make disciples of all nations. You know, I've heard all of that stuff, but I really started experiencing that idea, that partnership idea, in 2010 when I came to Grace, and I lived in Buddy's basement. I lived in Buddy's basement for about a year and a half. And as I was living there, we had tons of experiences together. We had experiences of putting a pool in the front yard. We had experiences of eating at Waffle House. And one time we even had a unique experience that he told me not to ever share, but I'm gonna share it this morning. So here we go. We had these birds in our backyard. We had chickens, we had roosters, we even had guineas. And the way that Buddy would describe guineas is he would say that this is the bird that represents middle school girls. He's like, this is the best way to describe what a guinea is. It's a bunch of middle school girls getting together. And he's right. When you're driving down his driveway, they're right there in front of you, and they're like, is he looking at me? Are we looking at what? Are we looking at this? And it even goes to the point that they really are like middle school girls, that there's a mirror in the back of Buddy's backyard when we were working on the bathroom. And they would all gather together and look at themselves in this mirror. Every morning, we'd wake up, loud noise, probably at 5 in the morning, you would just hear them chirping so loudly that we found them looking at themselves in the mirror, just like middle school girls would do. And so it got to this point, after having these guineas, waking us up in the night, being in the way of the car, not moving, trying to get into the house, all of these crazy things that were happening, Buddy said, you know what? I think it's time for a transition. I think it's time for a change. What I would love for you to do, Benton, and I would love to do this together, and John Raymond, who's the pastor at Grace Athens, was with us as well. He said, let's gather these guineas up and set them free in the wild. He tried to make it an optimistic thing. I know that he wanted to move on with these guineas. And so that's what we did, actually. We actually gathered them together in the back of a truck, and we set them free to Mother Nature where they could live away from our cars and chirp all night long if they wanted to. And I say this not to say that that's what we do with your middle school students. We don't put them in the back of a car. That's not why I'm sharing that. That's not what I think discipleship is put them in the back of a car, set them free in the wild, and just see them run. But what was happening on that trip was significant in my life. I was sitting in the truck, and what I recognized as we were driving, and even after the story, and even after all the many stories of partnering with Buddy, he didn't need me. Once the birds were in the truck, he could have just driven off on his own. Once we would go to Waffle House, he could have eaten on his own. When we were putting the pool together, he thinks that he could have put that together on his own. But in those circumstances, I recognized in some of them, he didn't need me, but he wanted me. The first little blank on your handout is sometimes the me things don't have the greatest impact until they become we things. You even think about this practically, like if you see an object that is heavy to lift or heavy to move, you recognize by seeing it, there's no way I could pick that up and move it. I need help. Yesterday, John, Brian Burchek, and AJ, who's one of our elders, they had a piano and they recognized, man, we need help. Who is someone who is strong, sturdy, and can move a piano? And so they called the big guns. Yes, that's right. They called me. And they said, we desperately need you. I don't think we can move this heavy piano out into this one area and move it into the house. And so I respectfully declined and decided, you know what? I'm empowering you to go move it on your own. No, I was out of town yesterday and I couldn't be there to help them out, and they did it. But I noticed it's really easy for the physical things in our life to recognize we need help, but sometimes it's hard in the spiritual things. I've seen it when I started in 2010, I was ready to start discipling kids. And as I started discipling kids, there was this Parkview D group that I invited over to the Chick-fil-A, and I said, man, I will pay for your food. And I'm expecting these 30 people that I invited all to come because, kids love food. They'll show up, they'll get discipled, it'll be awesome. And then 8 of them showed up, and I was like, gosh, where are the 22? What's going on? And I started pouring into their life, and then 8 kind of got down to 6. And as I kept going, I recognized, man, I cannot be the spiritual mentor of these kids' lives on my own. I need a partnership. I need people to come alongside. And sometimes we think in the spiritual world, oh, I can handle it. I can disciple this group, then I can go disciple this group. But as we begin to learn, just with the physical things, the spiritual things, we can sometimes have a greater impact than just those me things or just doing them on our own. And so in Acts, we see this. Go ahead and let's look at Acts 28, verse 1. We begin to understand this we mentality. We begin to understand this partnership, that there is a need for a gathering of people. And what does this gathering of people accomplish? Well, let's start in Acts 28, where we picked up off with last week of pastoring in every parish. Let's begin to look at what it means to partner with the next generation. Verse 1, after we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. I'll just pause here for a minute. As we've been tracking through the book of Acts, the writer Luke has often been writing in third person. He says he or she or them, as though he is distant from the story, like he had heard it from somebody else. But now, if we look at Acts 28, it is now shifted from a third person perspective to a first person perspective. He starts talking about I, we, us, me, all of those things. And actually, the we and us gets used in 27 and 28 over 40 times. And you're thinking, why in the world has he shifted from a first-person perspective in Acts 28? Well, actually, he has done this 4 times in the book of Acts. And so I want to look through this whole thread so that we can begin to understand what partnership actually looks like. So let's go back to Acts 16, and we'll finish with Acts 28. So look at Acts 16, verse 10. This is the first section of the we passages, or the more first-person perspective of Luke, like he was actually there. And I believe that he actually was in this situation. And verse 9 actually says this, going into verse 10 in chapter 16. Come over to Macedonia and help us. This is a vision that Paul got from a man in Macedonia. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. It is so interesting that Luke, being a writer, has now said, I am going with this gathering of people to preach the gospel. That he doesn't just look at his own occupation as, I'm a third person, I just gather all the sources, I just try to meet with all these people, and I try to write it all down. But he is actually encountering it face to face. He's actually there, seeing it. And so the first point on your handout is that we goes beyond spectating. We goes beyond just talking about it, but actually experiencing it and participating in sharing the gospel. I've gotten to see this with the Thrive Clubs. Randy would always say, man, the Thrive Clubs, it's one of the most special things we do. Thrive Clubs are a time that we meet in the morning on public middle schools. And before school starts, the students will share the gospel, the good news of Jesus, how God's experienced them in their own lives, and people are changed by it. Students are changed by it. And so I've heard Randy talk about it a lot, and I said, man, it sounds really good. In theory, it sounds like that works. But, how does it work? How does it happen? What does it look like? I have a lot of questions. And one of the first things that Randy did, and Buddy did this, and John does this as well, is they just invited me into actually seeing it, into actually doing it. And so the we goes beyond just kind of sitting in the background and kind of saying, hey, tell me a bunch of questions, tell me a bunch of theories of how to do discipleship or how to change the next generation, and moves into a time of participation. And when I actually saw God moving through these middle school students, it even when I just said that, it logically doesn't even make sense. God uses middle school students to change people's lives forever? Yes. And we get to see, when I saw that face to face, I was blown away. I was blown away that students would be so vulnerable. I was blown away that they would be so open. I was blown away that they'd be so bold to share about the experiences that they've had with God to these kids who may not even know who Jesus is. And when I saw it and experienced it, not only did it increase their faith, but it also increased my own faith to say, I don't want to just be a group of people called the church that just hears about discipleship. I want to be a group of people that gets to see this stuff, gets to experience this stuff. And so the first little section in Acts 16 is now Luke is no longer a writer hearing someone else tell about another story, but that he is actually going into this area to proclaim the good news. He is participating in the proclamation of sharing the gospel. He's not even just telling other people how to do it, but he is doing it himself. And so we see that we goes beyond just spectating. The next little section we have is Acts 20. The next we passage in Acts 20, starting in verse 7. Listen to Luke's articulation and perspective on this we passage. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. And he prolonged his speech until midnight. He didn't just say he gave a speech. He says he prolonged his speech till midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were all gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he then fell down from the third story, and he was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, taking him in his arms, and he said, "Do not be alarmed, for there is life in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away, he was alive, and were not a little comforted. I love this passage because you get to hear Luke's, what he's really feeling in this moment. We're gathered together in a room, and not only did Paul give a speech, but he prolonged his speech until midnight. No, wait, I take that back. He's now moved into daybreak. Now the sun is rising, and he's still talking. And he talks all the while longer. Guy falls out from a third story. Paul is still talking. You think he would have said, and then Paul got up and ran over there. No, he's like, I want you to get how uncomfortable I am with this we conversation right now. I've now moved into a time where this guy is boring me. This guy is annoying me. This one kid got so bored that he fell asleep, and then he fell out of the house. And Paul kept going. You know, it's like one of those things where you're like, okay, Luke, you're really annoyed at this we situation. And so point number 2, and then I want to give some examples. Point number 2 is that we goes beyond inconvenience. Luke is sitting there listening to Paul talk a long time until midnight. So he was talking way before midnight. He talks into midnight, then he talks into when the sun comes up. Paul talks that whole time. And Luke is like, man, this is so annoying. I'm so upset, or this other kid's so bored by it. I wonder what everyone else is thinking. But he also shows us that he's gonna go beyond. It's very inconvenient for him just to sit there and listen to Paul share these stories or tell these people about who God is. But he pushes back past convenience into inconvenience. I know for me, when I was writing this and I was talking to John, that I like the idea of we. I think the we model is cool. It's like we all go together to something. We all go disciple people. We all go pour into other people's lives. We pour into the next generation. But when it gets a little inconvenient for me, I stop. When I have to go drive to go pick up that kid because he can't drive to a house church. When I have to go meet with somebody in the middle of the night because they have some questions about certain things. It's gotten to that point of inconvenience. It's gotten to that point of like uncomfort. I don't know if you've ever been there where you're going together, you're like, man, I love pouring into this person, or I love being with my kids and pouring into their lives, but I gotta get up early in the morning. Now they wanna ask all these questions. I'm uncomfortable. And when you work with students, just a warning, hopefully you'll still sign up for the next generation after I say this. When you work with students and you empower them, it is some of the most uncomfortable times you'll ever be a part of. It's some of the messiest times you'll ever be a part of. And one time I was at a high school house church, and there was this student who I was huddling with a group of other students, and I came, and there's about 25 students in the room, and he starts talking about identity. I'm like, man, this guy's really good. He's going really well. You could tell he's a little nervous. You could tell he's a little uncomfortable. But he keeps talking. He goes, we label ourselves, and we want to be identified with what God identifies with us. And so he started talking about identity. He goes, we identify ourselves as like a brother, a sister, a breast friend. And we were like, what just happened? And he turns beet red, doesn't know what to say. He goes, I meant best friend or friend. You know what I meant? Oh my, and you just see him like backpedaling, turning red. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so uncomfortable for this guy. And you think that I'm uncomfortable sharing that in front of you. Just think how he was feeling when he was sharing with other students when he said that out loud. Another house church story, there's a kid who came to faith at one of our retreats, and he started wanting to get plugged into a house church. And he wanted to share the testimony of what God did. And so he was fresh in the faith. He starts showing up at this house. And he goes, I wanted to share my story of what God did in my life at this retreat. And so we're there. We're all gathered together. And he cannot stop cussing as he's sharing this story. And I'm like, okay, he's sharing about Jesus and what God's done. Yet he's so fresh. He like has no filter. And we have a bunch of kids who had grown up in a church that were part of this house church, and he had come in, and they were like, oh, and looking at me like, is he allowed to do this right now? Like, should you cut him off? Like, should you take him out of the room and have a conversation with him? It's a messy thing. It's inconvenient. It's uncomfortable a lot of times. But I recognize that that impact is so worth it, that the we is so worth it. It was funny, actually, I was preparing for this sermon yesterday, and I called John, and we talked for about 45 minutes, right around dinner time, the day before. It's his day off, it's Saturday. I get off the phone with the conversation about 45 to an hour, and right when I get off the phone, Megan says, is he irritated when you call him on his off day? And I said, yes, but it's worth the inconvenience. It was I was like, Meg, I'm so glad you asked that question. Let me share with you. No, I didn't do that. But it's uncomfortable sometimes with the we. It's sometimes inconvenient, but we see it is well worth it. At the very end of that story, this kid gets healed and people experience, even in the inconvenience of it all, they still experience God and they see him. They participate with God face to face, because of even the inconvenient, messy uncomfortableness that they stepped into. And we see that not only is it more than spectating or it goes beyond inconvenience, but there's something else that makes it well worth it. Let's go to Acts 21, verse 5. This is the third we passage. When our days there were ended, we departed and went on our journey. And they all, with wives and children, accompanied us until we were outside the city. And kneeling down on the beach, we prayed and then said farewell to one another. Then we went on board the ship, and they returned home. In this verse 5 here, we recognize the third point is that we goes beyond addition. That not only, if you think about it, not only is now Luke participating, remember the first we passage, and now he is participating in how to figure out how to share the gospel to the next generation, to these kids or to these people or the people in Macedonia. And then not only is Eutychus then impacted, they just add one to the impact of the we. The we has now impacted this person. But even in the third we passage, now it's like families, it's kids, it's wives, it's all of these people from the city gathering together. And now they are participating in the blessings of God, but also they're participating in this proclamation of the gospel. They were praying for these guys, these people who are the we, as they continued to travel. And so the we now goes beyond just not adding one person like Eutychus to the greater understanding of the kingdom, but now it has begun to multiply. It has begun to grow almost at an exponential rate. I was talking to Randy on Friday about this sermon, and I was telling him what I was thinking about. And he says, what we do is very unique. It's very subtle, but it's very unique. Is we don't just say here at Grace that we disciple the next generation, but we disciple to empower the next generation. That not only are we participating in proclaiming the gospel, but that we give up some of our own ownership, some of our own things, and we hand it over to the ones we're leading so that they can go and impact other people in their schools. I recognize whenever I go into high school, I like to say this a lot, is that I want to look at you and I want you to look at each other, that the person next to you can impact people that you can't impact. But also you can impact people that they can't impact. And so that we actually do need each other in this empowerment process. And so what we have pushed is that students would, no matter how messy, inconvenient, uncomfortable it may be, that they not only spectate about the gospel, but then they too go participate in sharing the gospel. To the point of we have to even give up some of our own places of influence so that they could step up into their own places of influence. And get to a place where we have to just lay that down. I don't know if you have a kid that you've been praying for, maybe your own kid or maybe someone you know that knows your own student. And you've been praying that they would follow Jesus. You've been praying that they would come. You've been spending all your time pouring into them, but yet maybe there's something that you just feel like is missing. Well, in that place, maybe there's a friend of them or a student or another student that they know that God is calling them to step into that situation. Maybe God's calling them to be empowered to step in to have that conversation. And so if you feel like you may be hitting a wall with your own student, just talk to one of their friends. Begin asking some of their friends even, hey, is my son or my daughter really going through this? Have you seen them begin to follow Jesus? Have they asked questions about Jesus? Because maybe, just maybe, we need to come alongside each other to impact this next generation. Maybe, as we see in the Bible, that people don't just need a spiritual father or a spiritual mother or just a spiritual brother or a spiritual sister, but they need all of that. They need spiritual aunts, they need spiritual uncles, they need spiritual grandmothers and grandfathers. That it takes a village to end up moving these students and moving people into empowerment. That it takes a village to impact villages. And so we need to understand that we're not just discipling people to just add and say, okay, the 8 people I discipled for the 4 years, maybe a couple of them will get into the kingdom and I've done my job. Yes, amen, that is awesome. But actually giving up some ownership and saying, man, what if they would start leading 8 people? What if they would start leading 6 people? What if they would have, I try to get to 30 at Chick-fil-A, but I could only get 8. What if those 8 could get those other 22 to meet at Chick-fil-A? What could happen when we begin to empower and move past the idea of just addition? The last little bit is where we started in Acts 28, and I want us to look at verse 15. And if you remember, in Acts 27 and 28, they experience a storm. They are struggling to eat food. They have to go to an island. Then a snake bites Paul. And then this ends up happening at the end of it. The end of verse 14, it says, "So we came to Rome, and the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him." So let's think about the big story of the we, right? They start in Acts 16, and if I am Luke, let's just say I'm Luke hanging out with Paul and the other people in the we conversation. And I'm sitting there, I'm meeting with them, and he says, okay, you're gonna go preach the gospel in Macedonia with me. We're gonna go together and do that. You're not gonna just sit here and maybe write some stories down. You're gonna go experience the good deeds of God. And then, kind of make him a little uncomfortable, then going to the next one makes him super uncomfortable when he hears this long speech from Paul, and this kid falls out because he has fallen asleep. And then we go to the next story, and in the next story, I didn't have time to get to it, but they traveled to so many cities. They traveled to so many different cities and meeting tons of different people, and then they came together and the people prayed for them, and then they had to go and travel again. And then the last we section, they hit a storm, they lose their food, they see Paul get snake bit on an island that they probably weren't familiar with, didn't know really the people there at that time. And then at the very end of all these we passages, Luke is still there. After all of the uncomfort, after all the inconvenience, after all the messiness, after all the sacrifice of letting go of their own things to empower these families, after the storm, the snake, the island, Luke is still there. I don't know if you're like me or not, but I would have left this story a long time ago. They had so many opportunities to just get off at any point because they traveled through ships, they traveled together, journeying together. They could have stopped at any moment. I probably would have stopped right about the time where I heard Paul still going into midnight, still preaching. I probably would have left right there. That would have been the time that I said, and then I left. That's probably what I would have added into that passage. But Luke is still there because he understands that we can have a greater impact than me. And so that last point there is that the we goes beyond me. The we goes beyond self-preservation. One of the best examples that I have seen this actually taking place, where the we goes beyond me, was from a woman named Karen Smith. She passed away a couple of months ago, and she had stage 4 cancer 7 years prior to that. And when she went to the doctor, they said, you only have about 1.5 to 2 years to live. And in those 7 years, she decided to understand this mantra that not only Paul had, but Jesus had, that we goes beyond me. And so what she decided to do was to pour into the next generation. She decided to be a part of Lug, be a Lug adult. She decided that in those years, that she was gonna pour into 6th grade girls, 7th grade girls, 8th grade girls. And then when it got really rough in the past 1.5 years, or not even that, maybe the past year, she said, I wanna sign up to be a D group leader for these girls. She was a nurse at our retreats, and she would take more medicine for herself than all of the students that were at the retreat. And she would say, you know what? We asked her about how she was doing. She was so tough. She was so strong. She would be honest. She would tell a little bit about herself. But then she would move and start talking about these girls. And these girls moved from like 5 girls into 6th grade to now they're at 36. I think we have a picture of about half of them at our latest retreat. They were the pink team, and so they had the breast cancer awareness flag there. That's about half of them. And then we got to see all 36 of them show up a couple of months ago to her funeral, and they were preaching the good news. They were reading scripture. They were coming up with poems about who Karen was. They were singing songs. They were leading worship. It was amazing to see this idea actually taking place in our midst. That she could have talked a lot about herself. She could have taken those 36 girls and said, this is a good opportunity for them to take care of me. She said, no, this goes beyond me. Karen knew that there was a limit to her life. And with that limit, she spent those 7 years saying, I want to pour into people that are going beyond my limits. I want to pour into people that can see and experience God while I'm here so they know how to see and experience God when I'm not. Karen understood this we goes beyond me. She understood that it was costly, that it would wear her out, that after she would have her discipleship group time, she would go home and just try to rest for the rest of the day. That even on the last little bit, I know that she would show up. I would see her discipling her students over here in this other room. And then right after that, she was going home to rest. She knew it was costly. She knew it was affecting her body. She knew it was taking a toll. But she also knew that it was well worth it. That the reward was so much greater. That the reward, not only did she get to taste and see how God was moving in her life, but she knew the reward even goes beyond her. She recognized, not only do I get to receive this reward, and now I get to see this reward through eternity, but now these girls get to experience this reward to eternity. Was it costly? Yes. Did it wear her out? Yes. Is the we before me gonna take a toll on some of us? Yes. But it is worth the reward. We see that Karen understood it. We see that Paul got it, Luke got it. And where they started getting it from was from Jesus, when he was calling them to go make disciples of all nations, pour into the next generation, and even into the Old Testament. This thread keeps going. This we mentality is not just a thread through Acts, but it's a thread through the whole Bible. And in Psalms, we have this passage on the screen. Psalm 78 says this. This is the thread that keeps going through. We, this idea of the group of Israel, we will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, so that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn. And arise, tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. That's the we section, and then has a little me kind of warning here. And that they should not be like their fathers, stubborn and a rebellious generation, going their own way, but a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. This Psalms passage shows the reason we talk about we is so that when the next generation steps up, they may know and experience God. But they can know and experience God past just spectating. That they could see, you know what? Someone took me by the hand and showed me how to participate in sharing the gospel. Someone showed me the good deeds of God. Someone showed me the commandments of God. Someone showed me who God was, the wonders that he had done. And so when I come across inconvenient moments, I remember what my spiritual mother, spiritual father, spiritual grandmother, spiritual grandfather said, that we can push beyond the inconvenience, that we can push beyond the spectating, that we can push beyond just addition for even our sake, and that we can even push beyond ourselves when the journey gets tough because of who God is and who we, told us about him and the hope that we can have in him. And so this message isn't only for us, but it's about the ones that we are called to impact as well. At the end of during the drive where we were setting the guineas free into nature, Buddy looked at me and he said, "So what do you have going on in your life?" I said, "Well, I'm going to propose to Megan this week." And he said, "That's the second most important decision of your life. And the first is the way you decide to follow Jesus." And so how do we follow Jesus? How do we follow Jesus well? By understanding that passage, by understanding Acts. The way that we follow Jesus well is that we follow Jesus well together. The way that we begin to see God moving in our midst is that we are moving together, even beyond anything that stands in our way. And though we may not see the fruit of it, we know because of who God is that the fruit will be there. We may labor, we may struggle, there may be hardships right in front of us, but we have hope in God that there will be fruit, even if it's past our own limit of life here on earth. We know and we have hope that that seed will continue to be fruitful even beyond ourselves. Let's pray together.